Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us once again on Kyle's Corner. Today, here I have an author that I recently read that I really enjoyed his book. Craig, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kyle. I appreciate it. My name is Craig Shreve. I'm a Toronto area author. This is my second book. I wrote a book called One Night in Mississippi that came out in 2015. The African Samurai just came out August 1st in Canada and the USA. So really excited to kind of be able to start sharing it with people and talking to people about it. And yeah, I've been in Toronto about 5 years. I'm originally from a small town about 3 hours from here, but loving the city. Excited about everything it has to offer. So it's been great.
Awesome. Yeah. What do you think about the reception of the book so far?
Yeah, everything's been really positive. So it's always a relief, but yeah, it's been very gratifying. The reviews have been good. It's getting a lot of positive media attention and like prominent placement in bookstores and everything. So everything's been really positive so far. It's been great.
Awesome. Yeah. So when I read the book, the reason that drew me to it is I had just happened to be reading about a similar area. I just finished Shogun by James
Okay.
Clavell. Have you
Yeah.
ever read that?
You know what? I'm about halfway through, so I have not finished it yet. But
Oh,
yeah,
really?
it's
Nice.
great. Yeah.
So that was a really good book. I really liked it. But he changed everybody's names. I was like, I don't want. I was like, these aren't the right names.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh, I was like in the mindset of it, and I just saw it pop up. I was like, oh yeah, Yasuke, awesome character, awesome historical person that I've always wanted to learn more about. Perfectly ripe for a historical fiction retelling. And so I was super excited to get to your book, and it just really delivered. I felt like Yasuki was such a strong character, and like for somebody that we don't know very much about, um, it can go either way, right? Like it can go where like it's the character comes across bland, but
Right.
it can also be where because you can fill in whatever you want, you can really get that like in-depth character portrayal. And I think you really nailed it. Do you want to maybe talk about why you chose Yasuki and how you came to write the novel?
Sure. First of all, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. I first came across this story just seeing a very short YouTube video, actually, several years back. I think maybe 2017, sometime around there. And it was very bare bones. It didn't have a lot of details. It just basically was mentioning that this East African man was the first foreign-born samurai. And my first reaction to that actually was that I didn't believe that it was true, because I couldn't believe that that is a true story and that I had never heard it before.
Hmm.
So, of course, I started digging into it, found out not only is it true, but there's it's so much more to it. It's such a remarkable true life story that has so many more elements than what this kind of like brief YouTube video had introduced me to. So, yeah, I started diving into it, and definitely, and as you said, it's the character that draws you. Yasuke, um, you know, several times throughout his life, his circumstances change so suddenly and so drastically, and the adaptability that he displays in being able not just to adjust to that, but also to succeed at every step of the way. That was really the kind of thing that stood out to me initially. And then as I was going through it in kind of more depth and started getting deeper into to the writing, um, it came to mind that we don't have anything in his own words. We don't have letters or diaries or journals. There's nothing that he left behind. And so that's the advantage of being able to work in fiction. There are some like nonfiction and documentary sources out there that talk about Yasuke's story. There's some very good ones. But they can tell you where he was and what he did, but they can't tell you how he felt.
Hmm.
So we need fiction for that. And so that's what I was really kind of focused on, was trying to give Yasuke's perspective on all of these events that he was a part of that were happening around him.
Awesome. How do you pronounce his name? I've never heard it said before, and I just kind of went on my own.
Right.
Yasuki?
It's actually Yasuke. I
Okay.
tend to talk fast and truncate it a little bit, but yeah.
Nice. Yeah, like I was the same way. The first time I ever heard of him, I thought it was just like somebody just wrote a fiction story about it. And I was like, "Oh wait, this is a nonfiction book. Interesting." And yeah, it is weird that he's not talked about more because it's such a remarkable story, and like just the things he must have had to go through to get to where he was and to like persevere through all that was really good. And I liked how like the samurai culture is depicted very interestingly here because Yasuke is coming from a place where he was the minority there. And so he was used to, sorry, what I mean to say is, he was coming from a place where he was seen by other people as the majority, but then he's going to, like, he becomes a slave, and then he goes to Japan, and he has to deal with like seeing a new culture through the eyes of like everybody there being like homogeneous, and how actually he's the one strange in this new land. And I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and so there's an interesting element to that in that so at this time, at this point in history, Japanese people in central Japan had very little experience with Africans. So in the port cities, they had seen them on some of the trade ships and etc. But in central Japan, they had very little experience with them, and so Yasuke was quite a draw and generated a great deal of attention. But the other element to that is that they didn't have any like prejudices or stereotypes. So Yasuke was actually accepted quite readily from everything that I've been able to discover to look at. Now there was resistance to him just by virtue of him not being Japanese, because as you mentioned, at that time it was a very homogenous culture. So there was some resistance to him as a foreigner, but it's the same resistance that the Europeans faced and et cetera. It wasn't specifically to him as an African or as a man with black skin. So that was kind of interesting to kind of work into the story, because that's not something that you see in a lot of fiction stories or nonfiction stories either. So that was kind of interesting to play with. And then, yeah, I think definitely Yasuke's big struggle when he's there is this feeling of isolation. So even though he is welcomed warmly in large part, he still looks around and recognizes that he doesn't fit in with where he is. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, his relationship with Nobunaga is really complex and dynamic in the book, because and I'm a little ignorant on what we have on what their actual relationship might have been like. Like, I know he was obviously part of his inner circle,
Yeah.
but like the interactions between the two of them, I think, are the heart of the novel, because you have Yasuke, who's always been treated as property and as a tool and as a chip to be bargained with, and he's learned that he can never really trust the people that he's around. And then Nobunaga keeps trying to like show him in these like conversations and through his actions that like, no, I treat people as people. And he's like struggling to come to terms with that, and like whether or not he should believe it. But yeah, I just really loved the depiction of those two in the novel.
Yeah, so some of that's a little bit of speculation, but it's based off of some like putting some pieces together. So one thing is that Yasuke was often invited to dine with Nobunaga, sometimes privately. So it's clear that there was a respect there that developed in time, at least, whether it was there initially or not. But definitely there was a respect there that developed in time. The other thing is, you Nobunaga also one of his kind of what his general Toyotomi Hideyoshi, which wasn't his name at the time, but Toyotomi Hideyoshi is one of his top guys. He
Mhm.
actually came from a peasant background. He had like no notable name or family, so it wasn't just seeing that Nobunaga elevated Yasuke. He had done it with someone else as well. So
Mhm.
there's nothing kind of clearly written definitive on it, but you can kind of piece that together and see that Nobunaga is someone who recognizes talent and will reward talent based off merit, as opposed to paying attention to class and name and that kind of thing. So there are a few pieces together that kind of support that relationship.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like taking little pieces of what we actually have and extrapolating is some of my favorite part of historical fiction. Like I'm a pretty big history nerd. I have a history minor, so it's like I always find when I'm like reading like primary sources, I'm just like, oh, that would be like a really interesting novel or whatever. So
Right.
being able to expand that out is super cool. Did you
Yeah,
have?
it's nice to be able to kind of like play in the margins, like you read the history and then you see what's missing.
Mhm.
And that's really where you can kind of dive in and tell some story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've written some historical fiction, and the research is the stuff that always that always gets me. I'm just like, oh man. Did you have like any grounding in the historical basis before you found the story, or like did you just have to come to 16th century Japan fresh?
Yeah. It's funny. I thought that I knew some stuff until I started researching and realized how much I didn't know. So yeah, definitely, I had to kind of immerse myself into the period. And the thing with like Japanese history is such a kind of like straight line. There's so much that's connected. So you really things that are happening in the 16th century, you kind of have to know a little bit about what's going on in 12th century, and etc. So yeah, there's a lot of digging to try to get the background, and especially when it comes to another culture's history, you want to get that right, right? So it's something that took very seriously. So yeah, there's a lot to learn, and as you say, you can kind of get caught up in the research. There are a lot of other pieces of the story that maybe don't connect to Yasuke directly, but that are fascinating things that you really want to include. And so that was part of the reason of writing in the first person is keeping the story focused on Yasuke and not making it a Japanese history book. That's not my story to tell. So telling through the first person has a couple of advantages. One, it like kept me focused on the character. Two, it again allows me to kind of look at the culture, from me as a writer, as an outsider, and from Yasuke as a character, as an outsider, both trying to learn and kind of immerse ourselves in it. And then, as I said earlier, it allows you to kind of like give his inner world and his viewpoint.
Yeah, I really liked that it was in first person. The book is told in like intervening flashbacks for most of it, where it's like you start off with him arriving in Japan. We won't get into spoilers yet, but just as the basic setup of the book,
Yeah.
he arrives with the Portuguese priests, and then every kind of roughly alternating chapter is like his how he got into slavery and like how he trained as a warrior and all that stuff. Um, the structure of the novel, did that come to you like right away, or did you kind of play around with it and try and tell it straightforwardly, or how did that evolve?
Yeah, not at all. I actually initially wrote it pretty linearly, so a lot of his kind of background and everything was at the front initially. And when I was working with the editor, she very wisely stated that the book has to start with his arrival in Japan, because that's really where the beginning of the heart of the story is. And so it was through the editing process and the subsequent drafts that we started to take that material out of the front of the book and kind of sprinkle it throughout.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I think it worked well.
Yeah.
Like it, the way that it was placed a lot of the time had like direct culture, like significance to what he was going through in the moment. So like it didn't feel like you were being pulled away to learn about his backstory. It felt like he's remembering what was going on to inform him of whatever's happening in the present day, which I think is very effective.
Yeah, I'm really glad that she made that suggestion, because as I was going through and kind of going through that editing process, um, I was able to kind of use those flashbacks to highlight important moments in kind of I'll say modern day history, but the kind of main timeline. So it was nice to be able to kind of connect some of those pieces. And so he tends to have these kind of flashbacks when there are kind of dramatic events in real time. So it's a bit of him kind of recovering his memory after having kind of blocked it out during some of his more traumatic periods. And it really kind of is meant to show him getting more comfortable as he spends more time in Japan and more time around Nobunaga and his men.
Absolutely. How was your writing process for the book? Like you mentioned that you kind of had to restructure it after notes from the editor. So like, did it take a couple big passes, or like, are you more of like a pantser, or like, how does your process work?
Yeah, I always write quick drafts and then spend a long time editing. That's I've talked to people who do it the opposite way, but that's kind of my method. Um, the advice that I got early on that was helpful to me was to just always write forwards on your first draft. Don't go back and edit anything. Don't change anything as you go. Just plow forward, and that's really what helped me kind of get past the stage where you spend all your time working on the first three chapters and not kind of spinning your wheels and everything. So I tend to write very kind of fast first draft, get it all on paper, and then start really kind of working on the novel on the second draft.
Right. Yeah. Get the bare bones in place.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. Some people like, I don't know if you know the author, Mark Lawrence, but he just like writes the whole book
Uh,
and then just like publishes it. He just like
uh,
barely edits anything. He has like 17 books. And I'm just like, that's insane. Like every time
yeah.
I go and sit down, I think of that and it just
I
Can't
wonder if
believe it.
he developed that over time or if he had that initially, because that is pretty
I've
impressive.
never talked to him about it, but I have
Yeah,
heard him say that like on his newest book that just came out this year,
yeah.
it was the first time he had to significantly edit something. He had to move like a
Wow.
chapter that was further in the book to the very front, and it's like the first time he's ever had to do that. And I'm like, that's crazy. I cannot believe
Yeah,
that.
no, that's a gift.
Yeah. So this is your second book.
Yep.
I know we're gonna be talking about this one mostly because it's the one that I've read and I have knowledge about. But do you want to talk about your first book a little bit and maybe how you got published and stuff? I know people are always interested in hearing those stories.
Yeah, sure. The first book it's called One Night in Mississippi. It came out in 2015. It also is historical fiction, but it's not as tied to history, I would say, as this one. So whereas this one kind of follows a specific historical story, this one is more One Night in Mississippi is more of just a historical period and backdrop to the event. So it's about this character whose brother is lynched and murdered in Mississippi in the 1960s, and the men are caught, but later released without any punishment. And this kind of haunts this main character, Warren, throughout his life. But then decades later, when the U.S. Department of Justice starts to reopen some of the civil rights era cases, he starts to reinvestigate his brother's death, and that leads him to an opportunity to confront one of the men that was involved. So I saw, it in the early part of the 2000s, the U.S. Department of Justice was reopening some of these cases, and
Hmm.
I was watching 60 and 70-year-old men going to jail for things they'd done 40 years ago and long since thought they'd gotten away with, and so that's what kind of inspired me to start working on that story. So I guess, I would say I started writing seriously maybe around 2008. I was kind of picking away at short stories and things before then, and had a few minor things published in some small literary magazines, but nothing significant. Um, I went to the Humber School for Writers, which is a kind of a one-year program where you essentially apprentice under another writer, and so you work on a specific manuscript over the course of that
Hmm.
year. And so then I submitted that to a contest called the Amazon Breakthrough Novel Award, which I don't know if it still runs, but it used to be an award for best unpublished novel. And
Nice.
so I made it to the semifinal round of that competition, and then based off of that, I was able to get an agent and start shopping it around, and landed with Dundurn for that book. So I grew up in North Buxton, Ontario, which is a very small town, but it is formerly known as the Elgin Settlement, and it's actually a National Historic Site. The government of Canada recognized it as a National Historic Site in 1999, I believe. And it was a prominent destination for slaves escaping the U.S. via the Underground Railroad. So I definitely, grew up around Black history. I was born and raised there, lived there till I was 16. Pretty much everyone in Buxton is a kind of an amateur historian. So yeah, I grew up knowing all these stories and hearing people talk about these stories. So I'm sure that certainly influenced me when I started writing.
Yeah, absolutely. What did you read like growing up? Like, what really got you interested in writing?
Um, I mean, a lot of the classic stuff. It really, I read Lord of the Rings. I read a lot of books, I think, fairly early. I probably read a couple of years ahead of what I should have been allowed to read. I didn't think
Same,
my
same.
parents just kind of
Yeah.
compromised that this is probably too adult a material for him, but at least he's reading something. So, I read Lord of the Rings when I was 11. I remember reading Stephen King stuff at like fairly young ages, and
Nice.
being impressed by his work. And yeah, so I started off with fantasy, and then I still actually um, I mostly read science fiction. That's kind of my preferred genre for reading. Um, but I also am a big fan of Cormac McCarthy, Kim Macklin,
I just
and
read Blood Meridian. Like, I just
oh,
finished like 3 days ago.
yeah,
Excellent. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's when some people say they don't like his writing, I totally understand it, but I love it. It's
Yeah.
just so
I
intense,
mean,
I think.
I would like if he used a little bit more grammar, but I still love the books. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. There's a lot of words you have never seen before.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, just but I read a mishmash of stuff. I really like reading international translations because North American writers, we all kind of learn to write the same way. But when you read some translations from other countries, sometimes you see some like surprising things that because they don't necessarily follow the same structure or tell the same types of stories, that kind of thing. So there's some really good stuff you can read internationally as well.
I absolutely agree. Are there any like specific translated works you'd like to shout out?
I'm gonna peek at my shelf here. Um, Roberto Bolano, 2666. It's like a trilogy, but it's also you can buy it as a single set. It
You said
is
2666.
yeah, 2666. Yep. By Roberto Bolano. And it's a trilogy, or you can buy it as a set. And after reading it, I still can't even really describe the story to you at all. I just remember being, obsessed with it. It's
Nice.
tremendous writing, and maybe a little bit difficult to follow exactly what's going on, but that's part of the joy of kind of going through the story. Yeah.
Oh, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to pick that up on that. I know so many people in our circle that are like just into the weird stuff.
Okay,
So, have you
that's
ever
right up
heard?
your alley then.
Have you ever heard of China Mieville?
I've heard of the name, but I don't think I've read any of the work.
Yeah, I haven't read him yet. I'm going to be reading him soon. But like all my friends that have read him describe him as just like the weirdest dude. He like does like these, like he'll be like people with bugs for head in cities
Okay,
and stuff, like just wild stuff. So I'm interested in
okay.
getting into
Well,
that.
I hope you guys are reading Jeff Vandermeer then, because that's my favorite kind of far out there author.
Jeff Vandermeer's good. Yeah, I read
Yeah,
Annihilation,
yeah,
and then I read the sequel when I wasn't quite in the mood for it. So I was like,
yeah,
I'll
okay.
pick it up, put it back down. But I really want to read Born from him. I've
Yeah,
heard that's
Bourne's
really
good.
good.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep,
awesome. So you're more of a sci-fi dude, huh?
yeah, yeah. For my own reading, yep.
Yeah. Are you gonna do a sci-fi novel at some point?
I don't know. There's just I mean, I would love to if the right idea strikes.
Right.
Um, but I guess I love reading that material, but I'm really not into kind of like world building myself. I like to have kind of a grounded setting to work from.
Hmm.
But again, yeah, I mean, if I get struck by lightning with the right idea, I definitely would go for it.
Yeah. Yeah. See, when for my own writing, I thought the same way. I wrote historical fiction for the longest time because I was like, I don't like world building. I don't
Yeah,
like making all that stuff up. I want a grounded setting. But then I
yeah,
started reading a lot more fantasy, and I realized I could just make things from history, but just turn them a little bit.
you can,
So
yeah,
I got a little bit more interested in world building that way. But yeah, I
yeah,
totally get the like having the bare bones of the world down already.
yeah. You know what? I think one of the kind of underrated aspects of world building is like the confidence it takes to know that this is going to resonate with people. Because
Absolutely.
you create stuff and you're just sitting in your room looking at it by yourself, and you think, this is crazy. No one's going to like this. Like no one's going to think this is serious or anything, So I don't think people talk about how much confidence it takes to create that kind of
Absolutely.
material.
For China Mieville to be sitting in his house being like, people with bugs for head, they're gonna love it. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So what are you working on right now? Like, are you working on another book or you
Not yet. I'm just doing research on a couple of things, and would hope to maybe start working on a new book in December, January. But right now, I'm still kind of deep in promotion and that kind of thing for the African
right,
Samurai.
yeah.
So I'm not looking to kind of start anything new. I'm not really good at keeping multiple things in my head at the same time. So I'm keeping focused on this for the next month or so.
Nice.
But yeah, I got a couple things that I'm looking into, and then we'll hopefully get cracking again.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must be so exciting to just have the book out on in there and just be like seeing it on shelves and like I went to my my local Indigo and
Yeah.
I just saw it on one of like the news shelves and I was like, "Oh, that's super cool." So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Like I said, it's been pretty prominently displayed, so it's been great to, friends send me pictures and that kind of thing as they come across it. So, it's nice to see, but it's also nice to see other people that are excited by it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have any say in the cover art? Like I've seen two different ones. I seen
You've
one
probably
that's like
seen the
real
UK
funky.
edition. So,
With just him on the horse in the front.
so that's the Canada and the US edition. So not,
Okay.
yeah. So this is the one. This
Yes,
is the
that's the
Canada
one
and
that I
US
have. Yeah.
edition. Yeah. So there's a UK edition that came out on August 24th, So you might have seen that cover. So they sent it to me and asked for my input, but I didn't have any say, and I shouldn't say say. I didn't have any kind of role in designing it or anything. And when I saw it, I loved it right away. So I just gave my thumbs up. So no, I didn't have any. I
Yeah,
didn't have
I
any
think
input.
the color's really vibrant. It really
Yeah,
shoots out at you.
yeah.
Um, I've heard that Netflix is trying to adapt it, which is really exciting.
Yep, yep. So they picked up an option. So for people who don't know what that is, it means that they have a temporary hold on the rights to give them some time to like negotiate with people and try to develop and see if they want to go forward with it. So that doesn't guarantee that there'll be a series, but
Mhm.
it's obviously a good first step. And so yeah, they did start doing some kind of pre-production work on it in the spring, but then the writer's strike
The writer's
hit
strike,
in March,
yeah,
so nothing's happened with it. Yeah,
yeah. They do seem interested in telling the story though, because they just did that animated one.
right.
Did you see that one with Lakeith Stanfield?
I did, and so that writer is Nick Jones Jr. is actually is the guy that's attached to this project. So I talked
Oh,
to him.
really? That's
Yeah,
interesting.
so he's a former Marine that was stationed in Japan. And so when I talked to him, he had always wanted to do, so he did that because he loves the story, but he wanted to do also like a more realistic one. So that one, that anime, of course, has a lot of like sci-fi and fantasy
Yeah,
elements
yeah.
in it. So it's good for introducing the characters, and there's some of the interesting real history is there in the background. But yeah, he wanted to do a more realistic version of it, and so when this came up, he was connected, and so I had some conversations with him, and I was able to see actually one of the scripts. I can't say anything about it, but yeah, he's doing a
Right,
great
yeah.
job. So yeah, I hope things get sorted out and that he's able to resume.
Yeah, well, that's super exciting, both for like you personally. Like, I'm very happy that you're getting that success, but also just that, like, hopefully that story is able to be done justice
Yeah.
and more people see it and stuff. Because I think that it's just so cool and interesting and just like a piece of history that kind of gets lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, somebody asked me about like why do I think this story's not more well known, and I didn't have a good answer initially, but I've been giving it some thought since, and I think it's because it doesn't really like fit into a category where you wouldn't necessarily get this story if you were studying Japanese history. You wouldn't get it if you were studying Black history, and so it really kind of made me think about when we slice up history that way, we miss some of the crossovers and connections that don't really fit neatly into any of those categories. So that's my best guess as to why this character is not more well known. But I
Absolutely.
definitely hope that he starts to become more of a mainstream character because, uh, you know, 12-year-old me, I would have had his poster on my wall. Like,
Hmm. That like makes me think. So there was the Last Kingdom adaptation, for the Bernard Cornwell books that are set in 8th century England or
yep,
9th century England too. And in the last season, there was a bit of like controversy because they had introduced some like black characters,
yeah,
and those characters didn't exist in the book or anything. But like
okay.
people were like, "Oh, they're just bringing them in." But I'm like, do people just not know that there would have been a
Right.
couple black people, and like they wouldn't have been like everywhere, but like yeah, and it's just
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying. It's because it's not sliced into the way we tell narratives about history. So
Yeah, so while I was researching this book, I of course, go off on tangents and waste time looking at other things that have nothing to do with the book. But
yeah, yeah,
how you get caught off on a Google
of
angle.
course, yeah,
So I was reading about, there were, some Moors that traveled with the Vikings. So there were Black Vikings, Black Cowboys, of course. There were Black conquistadors. Sorry. And then kind of to your point about, the British Empire, like the Roman Empire. um, I was reading an article that's talked about how it was, you know, vastly more diverse than what we think of it as because they had
absolutely.
spread so wide and were so influential that people from far-flung parts of the world would come to Rome to try to make a name for themselves. So we think of Rome a certain way and we see it depicted on TV a certain way, but there were people from all over the world that would come to Rome.
Yeah, Rome was a really big melting pot for that way, and then just like that is how a lot of like black slaves would end up in England, or even just like black freedmen, and
Yeah,
then they'd have families. They'd be in the auxiliaries for the Roman legions, and they'd be sent to England. So there's just a lot more movement in the world that
right.
I think our cultural perception gives us
Yeah,
when we learn about history. So it's always nice to kind of point out those stories.
yeah, for sure.
I do want to transition to spoilers before
Okay.
we end up here because I have a few more specific questions about
Yeah.
the book that I want to talk about. So before we transition to spoilers, is there anything you want to say to people that have not read your book to get them to go out and try it?
No, I think so. I try to, when you write historical fiction, there's always a challenge between giving enough of the history to people who don't know it versus not overwhelming people with a lot of historical facts. So I think that you don't need to have a background in Japanese history to come into this book. I tried to make it very kind of friendly for a friendly entry point. So yeah, I think it's a book that's accessible to anyone.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. I have a light grounding in this era. Like I know the big names, but I don't like, for instance, Ranmaru.
Yeah,
I did not know about him, but I knew
yeah,
about uh, Toyotomi, Hideyoshi, and
yeah,
so like I knew the big names, and I think you do a really good job at focusing on just the people you need to know for this
right.
story without getting overwhelmed in detail. So I would totally agree that if you don't know anything about Japanese history, you can pick this book up and have a wonderful time.
Thank you.
Awesome. So that being said, if you haven't read the book, I'm gonna spoil some stuff. So
Yeah.
all right, so
I always love the 400-year-old spoilers.
well, I'm not gonna spoil the history so much as I want specific character beats.
Okay, okay,
Uh,
yep.
Um, but yeah, that's actually funny because I did a read along with a friend, just real quick, where we were reading a Cicero historical fiction, and
Okay,
me and him, we knew like the whole Roman Emperor Cicero's whole life story, but a bunch of people reading along didn't,
okay.
and they were so enthralled with what was going on that they were like, "Don't tell us anything about what actually happened." The only thing we could tell them is that Julius Caesar was assassinated because everybody knew that. So it's
Okay,
just kind of funny.
yeah,
Um, but anyway, one thing I wanted to talk about is the way that Yasuki's cultural heritage is brought out more when he's able to be more himself around the Japanese, and how Nobunaga is able to accept that individuality.
yep,
I think the maybe my favorite scene in the whole book is when he realizes like his connection to the masks, and how he remembers the dancing that his father had done, and he does that dance, and then Nobunaga just comes down and gets on the same level with him,
yeah.
and just how that really like transforms his opinion of Nobunaga, and I think that's such a powerful scene. Do you maybe want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's actually a couple things to say there. One is, so that's not a historically accurate scene.
Mm.
That's one that's created, and the reason I created that is because um, since we're doing spoilers, so Yasuke's ascension to samurai in real life was, it seems, fairly undramatic. He just earned Nobunaga's respect over time, and he elevated him. So I felt like there needed to be like a moment that shows a transition in Nobunaga's kind of thinking about Yasuke, and a moment where he kind of sees him as um, someone who's an equal and worthy of the role. And so that's why I created that scene. But more broadly, um, when I first started working on this book and I'm kind of putting things together, I of course expected that I was going to be writing about culture clash and misunderstandings and that kind of thing. But then I kept coming across these really interesting parallels between African and Japanese cultures that I had not expected to find. And so the mask is one. Kind of the legends around Mount Fuji and Mount Numuli. Um, and, the some of the face painting and the kind of like tradition of speaking to your ancestors. There were a lot of little connections and parallels there in culture that I had not expected to find and hadn't really considered before. And so that really kind of shifted how I approached that whole relationship. And so and that's kind of what kind of led the way for that scene to be created.
Awesome. You said in the I don't know if it's the historical note at the end or the author's note, something like that, where you had to kind of guess and play around on where he might have come from, what tribe he might have come from, because we don't really know, and
Right.
how. So, like, did you then blend a lot of like cultural stuff, or did you try and base the cultural stuff on one tribe, or how did that end up?
Yeah, it's based on one tribe. So there is one document that records him as being from Mozambique and the Makua tribe.
Hmm.
That document, I think, was produced like 40 years after Yasuke's time. So there's plenty of reason to doubt that. But so I based, just because that's the only documented
Hmm.
source. A lot of people dispute that document and disagree with that origin. But because that's the only document, that's what I went with. But because there's so much uncertainty, I didn't mention that kind of specifically. But that is, all of the traditions are based off of that tribe.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, like that scene, I think is just a really good representation of how a person gets back in touch with their heritage, at least from, I mean, what I can understand. But
Yeah.
so I really love that scene. But one thing I also wanted to ask you about is the motivations of, I don't know how to say his name, Akichita, the guy who betrays
Oh,
Nobunaga.
Akechi.
Akechi.
Akechi
Okay.
Mitsuhide. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, as far as I'm aware, and I have not studied, we didn't actually know why he betrayed him. So, is all
Right.
the stuff with his mom is that, or did you just need a reason, or
So,
how did all of
so
that work?
yeah, so there are a number of different theories as to why he betrayed him. So that's not known for certain. There are a number of
Right.
theories, but that is one of the theories. So the events. So this is also in the author's note. Those events did play out, but they played out a couple of years earlier to when I
Mhm.
present them.
Right.
But yeah, his mother was offered up as a hostage, and then Nobunaga killed the Hatano Hideharu, who she was traded for. And so then that family killed Akechi's mother. And so that is one theory as to why Akechi betrayed Nobunaga. Other theories are Akechi was known to be very conservative, and at one point earlier in Nobunaga's career, he had um, burned a Buddhist temple and everyone inside it. And so Nobunaga certainly had some brutal acts, and I tried not to
Oh
shy
yeah,
away
for
from
sure.
that. You kind of have
Yeah.
to balance the truth and etc. But so that's one theory, and then of course there are other theories that bring in just there are theories that maybe Toyotomi kind of tricked him into betraying him so that Toyotomi could, there are a number of theories, and um, I don't know that there's more merit to one than the other, but that's the one that I thought fit best.
Right. Yeah. You just got to kind of go with what works.
Yeah.
Um, I really liked the way that it played out at the end, where like earlier in the novel you had him ask Ranmaru what he would do if Nobunaga commanded him to live,
Yeah.
and this guy just was like, what's for lunch? Like, he's just not
Yeah.
playing around. Like, and then now, like, he's in the exact situation where he's told to live, and then so he has to get out of the situation. And how the Portuguese priests really played a role in keeping him alive, I wasn't expecting. In structuring the end of that, because we don't know if he survived, right? Or do we? No, he did survive in real
He,
life
he,
from the.
he did survive.
Right.
So
Okay.
the way it played out in real life, he actually survived Honoji, and then you talked earlier about kind of keeping the cast of characters tight. So I eliminated Nobunaga's sons, who
Right.
play some prominent role. So what actually happened was Yasuke was with Nobunaga at Honoji during that kind of final stand. He was able to slip through Akechi's lines to where Nobunaga's son was fairly nearby and was attempting to warn him, but they were already under attack as well. And so he was actually captured at that castle defending Nobunaga's son. And so I collapsed that.
Makes sense.
And then it's
Yeah.
not known if, did he do that of his own volition or did Nobunaga order him to do that? That's an open question as well. But so that's how things played out in real life. But yeah, the ending was again, with historical fiction, when you don't get to wiggle around a whole lot with the way that
Yeah.
the things end, that they end the way they end. But he was captured. Um, he was berated by Akechi and then turned over to the Jesuits. Um, and then the record kind of disappears from there as far as I can was able. Yeah.
So at the very end, you have him just kind of going off to live his life. Obviously, you could have done a lot in that spot. You
Yeah.
could have hinted in a direction. You could have set up a sequel. So what made you decide to just kind of let him live his life as a freed man without any baggage to the Jesuits? And do we think there's more to him in the future for you, or do you think this is a firm ending?
Firm ending for me because I mean it's tempting. I actually kind of put some notes together thinking, what if I did do another? But it would be so kind of far removed from a historical basis. It would be entirely speculative. So
Right.
I didn't want to do that.
You can
But
bring in the aliens and stuff in that
well,
version.
yeah, exactly. My personal wish, I hope that he went back and joined up with the pirates. That's what I would have wanted for
Nice.
him.
Yeah.
But no, the way it ended, that's just, he's been gone from Africa so long that I didn't think he would have really kind of a personal connection to try to find his way back there. Didn't think he, had enough connection with the Jesuits that he would travel back to Portugal with them. And so, Japan was the place where he kind of had been most accepted. And so that's just kind of, I just kind of made that decision based off what I thought was most likely. I mean, the most likely is that he would kind of join up with Toyotomi or one of the other clans, and that's, I would say, most likely would happen. And I just had him kind of wandering off and on doing his own thing instead.
Yeah, going off into the sunset. It
Yeah.
worked though. I feel like it worked for the structure and themes of the novel. So the last thing I wanted to ask you, and this isn't actually really in the spoiler section too much. I just forgot
Okay.
to mention it
Sure. Yeah.
earlier,
Yeah.
which is just that so there's the servant girl,
Tomiko. Yeah.
Tomiko. So
So she's not a real character.
yeah, so
Yeah.
she's the like one real like invention character in the
Right.
book. And I guess what went into your motivation to creating her and her relationship with Yasuke, because she kind of has like an interesting, not parallel, but like juxtaposition to his position and how he views himself in the world. So
Yeah. So I'll come back to that question. I'll start with kind of what you touched on at the end there. I did have to kind of spend some time thinking about what's the difference between being a slave and being, a servant. In the 16th century, like what does freedom mean in the 16th century when
mhm,
everyone is really a servant to somebody to some extent? And really, it kind of comes down to treatment and opportunities and etc. But the reason I created Tomoko was really because all of Yasuke's other relationships in the novel are what you would think of as kind of like a professional level. So he can't let his guard down really with Nobunaga for the most part until maybe towards the very end. And even with Ranru and the rest of the inner circle, he's still kind of like a formal relationship. And so Tomoko is someone who really doesn't have any authority over him, and so he
mhm.
can kind of open up to her a little bit more. And so that was that character was there to be able to show a bit of a different side of Yasuke's personality.
Yeah, I really liked that. Like at the end there, he was like, I just wanted somebody to say goodbye to. I thought
Yeah,
that was a really affecting line. Like I kept coming back to that line and just being like, that's very touching.
that's actually one of my favorite lines to write, and I think it came fairly late in the editing that I added that in. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Well, it worked for me. So
Yeah.
all right. So we'll end up here right away. I just have one last question, which
Okay.
is what have you read recently that has blown you away? Like what would you recommend within, like, it doesn't have to be recently, like in the
Ooh.
last year or two, that just you would recommend sky high?
Okay, if you ask me that question on any day, I'll give you like a different answer every day.
Same, same.
But I guess one that comes to mind is the Moore's account by Leila Lalami. So I'll mention that one because if you like this book,
Right.
it's kind of similar. So it covers the first black man that was brought to the Western world. And what happens is I actually read this about a year ago, so I'm not going to get all the facts right, but
That's
um,
fine.
these Spanish settlers or colonizer, etc., they kind of get lost trying to find where they're supposed to go once they land, and they end up kind of breaking up into separate groups. And Stephen, who is this black slave that was brought along with them, he actually learns a lot of survival skills, and ends up, while they're lost, being a bit of the leader and more valuable person of the group. So it's like a total power dynamic change. Um, but then when they regroup, then it starts to slide back into kind of the original structure. So it's a really interesting book. It is based off a true story. I can't speak to. I really didn't look into it to see like how accurately it follows a true
Right.
story. But
Sounds really
yeah,
good.
yeah,
I'll definitely look into it because, like,
yeah,
yeah, I try to get into like different eras of historical fiction,
yeah.
and I, for whatever reason, like the like North American historical fiction, like the like 18th century onwards,
Right.
like there's a couple that I really like, but I've just never super gotten into them. So
Yeah.
that sounds like a great recommendation. So
Yeah, I think if you had trouble getting into it, then this one I think you'll like, because it doesn't try to cover a ton of history, it just covers this
mhm.
one very specific story in this small group of people. So
Yeah, that's
it's
what I
kind
love
of an
about
effective
historical
way to.
fiction is like being able to get interested in the history by the personal stories
Yeah,
and then finding out more as you dig deeper. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today, Craig. This has been awesome. Everybody go check out his book. It was really a great read. And check out his other book too. One Night in Mississippi is what it's called.
Yep, that's
Right.
correct. Yep.
Awesome. I'm definitely going to look into that. And is there anything you want to say at the end here to everybody, where people can find you online or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. My website is craigshreve.com. And I guess as far as social media, I'm probably most active on Instagram, and it's just CG_Shreve. So SHREVE. Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
All right. Bye, everybody.